Hey, let's talk about preventing fraud and locating weak spots in your company. As a business owner or a manager, you can recognize weak spots that fraudsters could exploit. Any holes in your security or internal controls can be considered a vulnerability. So in this video, we're going to discuss typical business vulnerabilities, the value of conducting a regular risk assessment, and methods for spotting security holes. In many cases, we're brought in as the ethics resource group to spot those holes because sometimes you're too close on the inside. Now, criminals who commit fraud are experts at finding and exploiting loopholes in a company's internal safeguards. So, what are some of the common weak spots that fraudsters might target? Well, one, due to a lack of separation of duties, a single employee may be able to commit fraud against a company without raising suspicion. That happens all the time with the office manager in the medical practice, for example. Or weak passwords make it simpler for fraudsters to access sensitive information like bank account details or customer data. Employees who have not received fraud prevention and detection training may be unwittingly able to increase the company's vulnerability due to fraud. That training is really critical. Inadequate background checks? Well, a company is at risk of fraud if it does not conduct sufficient background checks on its employees or vendors. And sometimes a lack of monitoring allows fraudulent activities to be committed by employees or third-party vendors. Those, obviously, without monitoring, go undetected. So, let's think about the value of frequent risk reviews. Conducting a regular risk assessment, what the possibilities are for fraud, is a crucial part of preventing fraud. A risk assessment is an analysis of the threats faced by the company and the safeguards put in place to deal with them. Regular risk assessments can help the business strengthen internal controls and detect and prevent fraud. And one of the things, let me just say this, it's important to understand you need to have the risk assessment by people sometimes outside of the company, because if you're in the company, you are so connected to what's taking place, sometimes you can't see the weakness. Chuck, what are the methods for locating weak spots in a company? Well, there are several methods that exist for assessing whether or not a company is susceptible to fraud. Management needs to conduct regular risk assessments to ensure that the company's internal controls are effective in preventing fraud. Test them. Make sure they work. For example, I was asked, or our team was asked, to come into a big box retailer and test the internal control. Now, when you walk out the door of, well, let's say Costco or Sam's, somebody looks at the receipt, purportedly they count what's in your basket, and then they mark on that receipt. Well, at this big box store, you walked out with the receipt, but the person standing there to inspect was on their phone. They weren't paying any attention whatsoever. So in one given day, we took the receipt that nothing had been marked on and went in and stole 7 televisions. Now, we did that with the understanding by senior management we were going to test the system. But the system that made sense failed if the employee was unwilling to do the fundamental task of checking and making sure that receipt could never be used a second or third or fourth or seventh time to walk out with large TVs. Now, by putting in place internal controls, you can lessen the likelihood of fraud occurring and speed up the discovery process should it happen. Internal controls include enforcing strict password policies, assigning roles and responsibilities, and performing regular audits, testing it. Now, when you're dealing with money, looking for discrepancies that could point to fraud is always an excellent idea. Verifying previous addresses, background checks on all new hires and all new vendors can help spot fraud risks. And educating workers on spotting red flags for fraud and taking preventive measures is a win-win for businesses and their employees. So, as we wrap up this video, let's think a little bit about understanding where your company may be susceptible to fraud, and that's crucial. The lack of segregation of duties, weak passwords, lack of employee training, they are all potential entry points for fraudsters. Conducting risk assessments regularly can help pinpoint weak spots and verify that internal controls are doing their job to forestall fraud. You can lessen the likelihood of fraud occurring in your company by taking measures such as installing internal controls, keeping tabs on monetary dealings, checking references, and training workers. Now, following videos, we're going to delve into methods that can be used to both prevent and identify fraud. So, subscribe below, and let's look for number 3.